Making moves on the world stage, how President Trump is handling allies and adversaries as part of his push for peace in the new year. Good morning. We are almost to a brand new year. I'm Molly Line. Bill and Dana are off today. Hi, Bill.
Hey, Molly. Good morning to you. Great to be with you once again. I'm Bill Malugin, and this is America's Newsroom. The president hosting world leaders at Mar-a-Lago. That includes Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The president praising Netanyahu's leadership as Israel is now looking to enter the second phase of a U.S. brokered peace deal.
Look, he's a wartime prime minister. He's done a phenomenal job. He's taken Israel through a very dangerous period of trauma. Israel with other people might not exist right now, if you want to know the truth. That's a pretty big statement, but it's true.
President Trump also hosting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The president said a Ukraine peace deal is closer than ever, but disputes over territory remain unresolved.
And in the meantime, the U.S. is ramping up its pressure campaign against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, with President Trump touting a major explosion near Venezuelan drug loading docks.
Lucas Tomlinson is reporting live from West Palm Beach. Good morning, Lucas.
Good morning, Molly. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was the first foreign leader to visit President Trump in the White House when he returned to office. And now he's likely the last world leader that President Trump will be meeting with this year after their meeting yesterday at Mar-a-Lago. And yesterday, Trump was asked if he would support Israeli strikes on Iran's ballistic missile or nuclear programs.
If they will continue with the missiles, yes. The nuclear, fast. Okay. One will be yes, absolutely. The other was, we'll do it immediately.
So that was a yes, Molly. In the Pacific, U.S. forces continue its strikes on alleged drug boats. Here it looks like a pair of 500-pound bombs were used to destroy this alleged drug boat, the 30th strike since combat operations began in early September. And now these strikes have turned inland. President Trump telling reporters yesterday the United States struck a dock in Venezuela used to transport drugs.
There was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs. So we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
As part of that peace plan you mentioned, Molly, U.S. forces have now launched strikes in Venezuela, Nigeria, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, and the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific this year. Since Trump returned to the White House, Netanyahu is the second world leader to visit the Winter White House in Palm Beach in as many days. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visiting Sunday, and some eyebrows were raised when President Trump said Putin wants Ukraine to succeed. Our colleague Brett Baer asked Zelensky about this last night in his exclusive interview on Special Report.
You don't agree with that?
No, it's not about agree. I don't trust Russians, and they don't want. I don't trust Putin, and he doesn't want success for Ukraine.
And combat operations continue in Syria. U.S. Central Command, responsible for all American forces in the Middle East, said U.S. and partner forces, likely Syrian forces, conducted raids resulting in 25 ISIS fighters killed or captured just in the last 2 weeks since those massive strikes against those 70 ISIS targets after 2 American soldiers from the Iowa National Guard were killed and their American interpreter, Molly.
Great point. Lucas Tomlinson covering a very wide map for us this morning. Greatly appreciate it, Lucas. Bill?
Molly, for more on this, we are joined by Rebecca Heinrichs. She's a national security analyst at the Hudson Institute. Rebecca, good morning to you. Thanks for coming in today.
Good morning.
So ahead of this meeting yesterday, there had been some reports emerging that there was a bit of a rift developing between the Trump administration and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And President Trump really seemed to throw a lot of cold water on that. He was heavily praising Netanyahu, even went as far as saying that Israel may not exist if they had a different prime minister. Do you think the president put those rumors to bed?
I mean, he certainly gave it a shot. I think there's been a drumbeat in the media would like to see some space between the United States and Israel, and even some from the far right of the president's base kind of want to see him back away from Israel as well. Of course, the majority of the president's supporters support the United States backing Israel, but President Trump really showed that there's no daylight between him and Bibi Netanyahu. U.S. interests is inextricably tied to the success of Israel and to make sure that Iran obviously stays weakened in the region and that Hamas is fundamentally disarmed.
And speaking of Iran, there have been some reports emerging that they're trying to restart their ballistic missile program. President Trump was asked about that during their joint press conference yesterday, and he gave a warning to Iran. Let's take a listen.
Now I hear that Iran is trying to build up again, and if they are, we're going to have to knock them down. We'll knock them down. We'll knock the hell out of them, but hopefully that's not happening.
Rebecca, at this point, Iran has to know he's not bluffing.
No, he's not bluffing, and isn't it amazing? After the Israelis and the United States carried out those military operations to degrade their ability to protect their own strategic systems, their nuclear program, that the Iranians are not now turning and focusing on their domestic life. Instead, they are rebuilding their ballistic missile program with the help of the Chinese. The Chinese are providing the precursors for solid rocket fuel. And President Trump has been clear that if they were to do that, that Israel would have a free hand to take care of that. The United States might support. And certainly if they began to restart their nuclear program, which the United States degraded in Operation Midnight Hammer, that the United States would support striking those sites again.
And as they try to move into phase 2 of this peace deal in Gaza, one of the big sticking points has been the fact that Hamas has to disarm. They can't be the ones that stay in power in Gaza. Our colleague Brett Baer sat down with Netanyahu. Part of that interview is going to be airing tonight. But during that interview, Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about the idea that the Palestinian Authority could remain in power in some way there. Let's take a listen to that.
I think President Trump put clearly the conditions of reform that he wants to see in the PA for them to be involved. And I think he put it very clearly what he wants to see, the kind of real reforms, not just perfunctory reforms, but real reforms. Stop pay to slay, change the curriculum in your textbooks, open up a different society and a different future if they do it.
So apologies, that obviously wasn't from Brett's interview. That was from the presser yesterday. But just give us your thoughts on that. Do you think the PA could have a future in Gaza?
I'm skeptical. Bibi Netanyahu would know better than me, but if you hear his conditions, they would have to completely change their approach to society, their education, how they're indoctrinating young people not to be anti-Semitic, not to be anti-Israel. So those are a lot of ifs in those conditions there as well. But yes, I mean, fundamentally, the next phase of this requires Hamas to disarm and to leave. They cannot be in power, so somebody else has to take over. And the other key part of this is that the United States has said that these Gulf partners are the ones that are going to go in there and eliminate Hamas if Hamas does not disarm.
Mm-hmm. Another meeting at Mar-a-Lago recently was with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He met with Trump once again. They've had several meetings. They're still trying to iron out this peace deal with Russia, and they've been really held up on the idea of land concessions. Volodymyr Zelensky did sit down with our colleague Brett Baer, and he talked about how difficult it's been when it comes to the land concessions. Let's take a listen to that.
It's about territories. Yes, this is a difficult question. This one point, we have different views with Russians. We can't just withdraw from our territories. It's not only the law. People live there. If we do free economic zone, that we have to move some kilometers back, it means that Russia has to make mirror steps some kilometers back. And this free economic zone will have specific rules. If we will decide.
So Zelensky went on to say that if there were going to be any land concessions, Ukraine would have to have a referendum and put it to voters, but he doesn't think Ukrainian voters would ever approve that. So, Rebecca, we got about a minute left here. How do you get past this sticking point?
Great interview by Brett Baer, by the way. In that point, what Zelensky said was he believes that 85% of Ukrainians, they do want peace. They want the war to be over, but 85% are not going to concede that land. That's really important because conceding that land would bring about more war. It would enable Russia to continue to fight. The other thing that's important is he said that in order to have a referendum, a vote, you would need a ceasefire in order for people to come out and vote. Russia has so far not been willing to have a ceasefire. And so the Russians have to have a ceasefire. Instead, the Russians continue this onslaught, even now, against civilian targets in Ukraine. So again, Zelensky is demonstrating he's willing to make concessions, he's willing to negotiate. Still remains the Russians that are the problem.
Yeah, the big question, do the Russians even want peace at this point? So far, they haven't shown that they do. Rebecca Heinrichs, great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.